On a bright August afternoon in 1909, in the marble ballroom of Marble House in Newport, Rhode Island, the light off the Atlantic glances across a row of porcelain cups that do not say Vanderbilt. They say Votes for Women. The gilt-edged saucers, specially commissioned for the occasion, rest on linen embroidered with her initials, AVB Alva Vanderbilt. Belmont pauses before the long table, straightens a place card, and then, with a gloved hand, sits to write a final note of welcome on thick monogram stationery. The ritual looks familiar. Another guest list, another luncheon. But the names on this list are not dukes and duchesses. They are speakers, organizers, striking shirtwaist workers, women from Harlem clubs. In a photograph taken that summer, she stands beneath crystal chandeliers, severe and composed. The caption mentions only a suffrage conference at Marble House. It does not record the quieter truth that this time the paper in her hands is meant to change more than seating arrangements. It is meant to change the law. On 6 November 1895, the bells of St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue in New York ring over a crowd pressed to the railings as Consuelo Vanderbilt walks toward the altar to marry Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough. Newspapers describe the scene in loving detail. The ivory satin embroidered with seed pearls, the lace veil that once belonged to Marie Antoinette, the orchids massed at the altar, the crowd of thousands outside pressing for a glimpse of the bride. The New York Times reports that police struggle to control the throngs, that women faint in the crush, that the spectacle rivals any royal wedding in Europe. Inside the church, incense drifts through Gothic arches while organ music swells to fill the vast space. The pews are filled with names that read like a directory of American wealth: Astors, Belmonts, Whitneys, Goulds. Somewhere behind the carved pews, seated in a place of honor appropriate to the mother of the bride, Alva Vanderbilt watches the ceremony she has engineered with the same strategic precision she once applied to conquering Mrs. Astor's social fortress. Her face reveals nothing. Her posture is perfect. Her costume is magnificent, black velvet trimmed with sable, a fortune in diamonds at her throat and wrists. Years later, in testimony given for the marriage annulment in 1926, she will admit with startling directness, "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke. I have always had absolute power over my daughter." The phrase, preserved in Vatican archives and quoted in multiple biographical sources, reads today like an indictment more than a boast, a confession that undercuts every claim to maternal devotion. Yet at the moment of the wedding, as Consuelo speaks her vows in a voice witnesses describe as barely audible, Alva sees only triumph. A Vanderbilt has secured a dukedom. American railroad money has purchased English aristocratic lineage, and her own social position is secured beyond challenge. The marriage settlement, negotiated over months and documented in legal papers preserved in both American and English archives, is staggering. Consuelo brings a dowry of $2.5 million in railroad stock, equivalent to over $80 million today, plus an annual income and provisions for any children that will ensure Blenheim Palace's financial stability for decades. In return, Consuelo receives a coronet, a place at the pinnacle of English society, and a life she does not want. That evening, in the Vanderbilt house on Fifth Avenue, where a wedding breakfast has been served to hundreds of guests on gold-rimmed china, Alva performs a familiar ritual. Seated at her rosewood writing desk inlaid with mother-of-pearl, she begins the thank you notes, her gloved hand moving quickly across thick cream paper embossed with her monogram. The letters of gratitude, composed in elegant script and sealed with burgundy wax, conceal a different ledger, one of power, coercion, and a title bought at the price of her daughter's tears, recorded years later in Consuelo's memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, where she describes standing at the altar, weeping behind my veil. The sound of the pen scratching across paper mingles with the distant murmur of departing guests, the rustle of servants clearing tables, the faint music still playing in the ballroom below. Each letter reinforces the narrative Alva has constructed: a perfect match, a love story, a triumph of American energy and English tradition. The truth that Consuelo loves another man, that she begged not to go through with the ceremony, that Alva threatened illness and death to enforce compliance, remains unwritten. The very skills that made Alva a reigning hostess, resolve, strategy, mastery of appearances, have just been used to bend another woman's life to her will. The next time her pen moves with such purpose, it will be in the service of a very different cause. By 1906, Consuelo, now Duchess of Marlborough, is living largely apart from her husband at Blenheim Palace and in London, their official separation quietly acknowledged in society pages that speak of the Duchess's charitable work and the Duke's political interests, without mentioning that they rarely occupy the same residence. The marriage, presented to the world as a fairy tale of transatlantic alliance, has revealed itself as precisely what it was: a business transaction in which one party provided money and the other provided title, with affection never part of the contract. From New York, Alva reads the transatlantic coverage in newspapers and society columns, respectful notes about the Duchess's charity work with London's poor, her support for housing reform, her advocacy for children's welfare, careful silences about an unhappy marriage, about separate lives, about a woman trapped by the very social machinery her mother mastered. The clippings accumulate in a drawer of Alva's desk, a paper record of consequences she does not yet acknowledge. In that same year, in her New York townhouse on Madison Avenue, where winter light falls weak and gray through tall windows, Alva sits again at a writing desk. The room is quiet, except for the rustle of silk as she shifts position, the tick of a French clock on the mantel marking time that feels increasingly heavy, the faint street noise of carriages and automobiles. The city is changing, modernizing, moving into a new century while she remains fixed in patterns established decades earlier. The temperature in the room is precisely controlled by the new steam heating system, but she feels cold nonetheless. The correspondence she conducts now includes private letters exchanged with Consuelo, fragments of which survive in later biographical accounts and in Consuelo's own memoir. They are formal in tone. "My dearest mother," begins one letter quoted in a 1952 biography, continuing with news of London's social season and charitable committees. But under their smooth sentences, beneath the dutiful phrases about weather and health and social obligations, lies the cost of that 1895 decision, a distance that cannot be crossed by paper and ink alone, a wound that formal language cannot heal. Consuelo's later recollection, published in The Glitter and the Gold, of standing at the altar weeping behind my veil, becomes, retrospectively, a kind of diary entry for both women. The daughter's tears measure the limits of the mother's power, the boundary where authority becomes cruelty. Some biographies suggest Alva never fully grasped this distinction. Others hint at growing awareness, at guilt that cannot be spoken, but shows itself in increased charitable donations, in letters that grow more frequent and more anxious, in questions about Consuelo's happiness that arrive too late to change anything. The architecture of privilege, transatlantic titles purchased with American fortunes, great houses maintained by enormous dowries, social positions secured through strategic marriages, has produced exactly what it was designed to produce: status for the family, alliance between wealth and lineage, newspaper columns praising the match. But it has also produced isolation for the girl at its center, a young woman living in a palace that feels like a prison, married to a man she does not love, separated from the life she might have chosen. In photographs from this period, Consuelo appears regal but remote, her posture perfect from years of training, her gowns magnificent, her face beautiful and utterly sad. She performs her role flawlessly: the charitable duchess, the gracious hostess, the ornament to English aristocracy. But anyone looking closely at those photographs can see what it cost. Alva, looking at the same photographs in New York, perhaps begins to understand. When that architecture begins to crack, when Consuelo's marriage moves toward separation and eventual annulment, when the certainties of The Gilded Age dissolve under social and economic change. Alva will have to decide whether her authority exists to keep women in place or to help them move. On 10 June 1908, at Brook Holt, her country estate in East Meadow, Long Island, Alva's second husband, Oliver Hazard Perry Belmont, died after an operation for appendicitis at age 50. The New York Times records his death the next day. The obituary, spanning multiple columns, lists his political career as Democratic congressman representing New York, his racing horses that won major stakes races, his club memberships that connect him to the city's most powerful men, his architectural passions that produced Belcourt in Newport. The funeral draws hundreds. The flowers fill multiple carriages. The house is quiet after the funeral cortege leaves for Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx, after the last guests depart with murmured condolences, after the servants close the great doors and draw the curtains against June sunlight that seems inappropriately bright for a day of mourning. In one upstairs room, where Alva has retreated from the press of people and the weight of expectation, the window opens onto lawns where peacocks wander and gardens bloom in riotous color. At a small desk, positioned to catch the light, she removes her black mourning glove to sign yet another document, this time legal papers confirming her position as wealthy widow with control over Marble House in Newport and considerable independent fortune from both Vanderbilt and Belmont sources. The scratch of pen on paper, the weight of the seal pressed into wax, the stack of documents growing as lawyers handle the complex estate. These rituals are familiar from her first widowhood after divorcing William K. Vanderbilt in 1895. But something has shifted in the 13 years since. She is 65 years old, independently wealthy, answerable to no husband or father, free to direct her own life in ways few women of any class can claim. The question becomes, what will she do with that freedom? In the months that follow, society columns note her travels to Europe, extended stays in Paris and London that previous biographers attribute to grief, but that serve another purpose. She attends lectures in London about women's political rights, including rallies organized by the Women's Social and Political Union, led by Emmeline and Christabel Pankhurst. These are not polite drawing room discussions, but mass meetings, speeches that call for militant action, demonstrations that sometimes end in arrests. Newspaper accounts from 1908 and 1909 place her name in audience lists, note her presence at suffrage events, record her growing interest in what the British press calls the woman question. She meets with British suffragettes, listens to accounts of force-feeding in Holloway Prison, hears arguments about why property destruction might be justified when a peaceful petition has failed for decades. She attends conferences where working-class women and aristocrats sit side by side, united by the common disability of being female in a legal system that defines them as less than full citizens. The contrast with her own life is stark. She has commanded social empires, built palaces, negotiated with dukes and senators, yet she cannot vote in the country whose wealth she helped display to the world. By the time she returns to New York, something has changed. The woman who once leveraged marriage contracts to secure her daughter's title now listens to speeches about a different contract, the social compact between government and governed and women's right to consent to the laws that govern them. In 1909, she will open the doors of Marble House not for a ball celebrating social conquest, but for a political meeting about women's rights, and her gloved hand will direct a different kind of performance. In the summer of 1909, Marble House on Bellevue Avenue in Newport, the palace Alva built as a birthday present for William K. Vanderbilt in 1892. The monument to her triumph over Mrs. Astor, the marble temple that cost $11 million and established her as Newport's reigning queen, becomes a classroom. Rhode Island's suffrage timeline, documented by the Preservation Society of Newport County, notes that Alva Belmont hosts the first of 2 women's suffrage gatherings there that year, marking a transformation of a private palace into a public meeting space that shocks and delights newspapers in equal measure. Under ceilings painted to rival Versailles, where clouds and cherubs drift across gilt plaster and sunlight filters through windows overlooking the Atlantic, chairs are lined in rows rather than circles for waltzes. The ballroom, where Alva once hosted costume balls and receptions for European nobility, now holds women in shirtwaists and simple skirts, sitting beside women in silk and pearls. The mixture of classes almost as shocking as the political purpose. On a side table positioned near the French windows, the Votes for Women china catches the light, white porcelain with the slogan in blue script, each cup and saucer specially commissioned, a pattern later cataloged in suffrage memorabilia collections and now held in museums documenting the movement. The sensory experience is distinctive. The cool marble floors under feet accustomed to thick carpets, the ocean breeze carrying salt air through open windows and mixing with the scent of cut flowers arranged in massive urns, the sound of waves breaking against the rocks below, punctuating speeches about economic justice and political rights. Women fan themselves in the summer heat despite the grandeur around them, their conversations mixing accents from Beacon Hill and the Lower East Side, from Harlem and Park Avenue. At a polished writing table positioned just off the ballroom in the Gothic room with its carved walnut walls and stained glass windows, Alva writes introductions and program notes in her own hand, composing the order of lectures like the order of dances at a ball. But now the choreography serves political rather than social purposes. Her training in deportment and conversation, once used to navigate Mrs. Astor's drawing room and impress European aristocracy, is now turned toward briefing speakers on how to address mixed audiences, coaching nervous working-class women on how to project authority, and managing press coverage to ensure the event is reported seriously rather than dismissed as society ladies playing at politics. Contemporary newspaper accounts from the Newport Mercury and Providence Journal describe the scene with a mixture of curiosity and condescension. Society matron Mrs. O.H.P. Belmont hosting radicals in her palace, the incongruity of political organizing amid such luxury, questions about whether wealthy women can genuinely understand working women's concerns. But the speakers include not just society figures, but labor organizers, settlement houseworkers, and women who have spent years building the suffrage movement from grassroots organizing rather than ballroom speeches. The same skills a finishing school might prize: posture that commands attention, diction that carries to the back of a room, strategic silence that lets others speak while maintaining control of the agenda, have become instruments of political theater. The refinement Alva learned at convent school in Paris, perfected in New York drawing rooms and wielded to conquer Newport society, now serves a movement that seeks to dismantle the very social structures that produced her power. As evening falls and the last attendees depart, walking down the drive past peacocks settling for the night and through gates where curious locals have gathered to watch, Alva remains in the Gothic room, writing letters to potential donors and speakers for future events. The pen moves as quickly as ever. Only the addressees have changed. Outside the Marble House gates, another kind of school is about to open: the picket lines of New York shirtwaist workers, where refined women will stand alongside factory girls in what newspapers will call the uprising of the 20,000. On a cold November afternoon in 1909, crowds gather near New York's Cooper Union as thousands of shirtwaist workers, most of them young immigrant women who spend 60 to 70 hours a week at sewing machines in dangerous conditions for wages barely adequate for survival, vote to strike, an action remembered as the uprising of the 20,000. Contemporary accounts from the New York Times and the New York Call describe a mass meeting where speaker after speaker recounts conditions in the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory and similar establishments: locked doors, sexual harassment from foremen, fines for arriving minutes late or for damaged cloth, wages so low that families cannot survive without multiple incomes. Among the supporters who soon appear on the picket lines, enduring cold and harassment, and the threat of arrest, are wealthy society women quickly dubbed the Mink Brigade by newspapers, amused and disturbed by the spectacle of fur-collared ladies linking arms with factory girls in threadbare coats. The rustle of silk mixing with the rough wool of work dresses. The contrast between women who have never worked for wages standing beside women who began factory labor at age 12 creates visual drama that photographers eagerly document. Alva Belmont joins this effort with characteristic thoroughness, bringing not just symbolic presence but substantial resources, raising funds that will total thousands of dollars, renting the massive New York Hippodrome for a mass rally that draws over 10,000 attendees, personally attending court hearings for arrested picketers and paying fines and bail for dozens of women. Contemporary photographs show her on picket lines in an elegant dark coat and hat, her posture as perfect on a freezing sidewalk as in a Newport ballroom, her face set with determination as police officers move to make arrests. Press clippings from late 1909 and early 1910, preserved in archives at the Tamiment Library and the Library of Congress, show names like Anne Morgan, daughter of J.P. Morgan, and Alva Belmont appearing alongside Clara Lemlich, Rose Schneiderman, and other labor organizers. The coverage reveals tensions that run beneath the surface. Socialist leaders question elite motives, suggesting wealthy women want to channel working-class militancy into respectable suffrage advocacy. Some suffragists fear association with radical workers will damage the movement's reputation, and workers themselves debate whether accepting help from millionaires compromises their labor struggle. The cold November wind cuts through even fur coats. The sound of police whistles and angry shouts mixes with the tramp of picketers' feet on frozen pavement. Women stand for hours, their breath visible in the cold air, holding signs demanding fair wages and safe conditions. When thugs hired by factory owners attack the lines, the wealthy women are spared. Their class provides protection even in radical spaces, but they witness violence that shocks them into understanding what it means to fight without social armor. That night, back in her Fifth Avenue house where servants have prepared dinner and fires burn in every room, Alva writes yet more letters, this time to potential donors whose names she knows from decades of society connections, to editors of newspapers who have covered her social triumphs and might now cover workers' rights, to lawyers who can defend arrested strikers in court. The temperature in her study is comfortable. Her dinner waiting downstairs will be elaborate and perfectly served. The contrast with the lives of women still standing on picket lines is not lost on her, though whether she fully understands it remains ambiguous. The posture drilled into her as a debutante learning to walk with books, balanced on her head now, allows her to stand, unmoving, on long picket lines in weather that tests endurance. Refinement, once a private asset cultivated to attract suitable husbands and impress social rivals, has become a form of public armor, protecting her as she crosses class lines, lending legitimacy to causes that newspapers might otherwise dismiss, but never erasing the distance between her and the women whose wages she defends. The next lesson she designs will not be for dancers or strikers, but for suffrage students in settlement houses she funds across New York, creating infrastructure for a political movement that will span more than a decade. By 1910 in New York City, in a small office on West 42nd Street where morning light falls across desks piled with pamphlets and correspondence, Alva has founded the Political Equality Association, also described in some sources as the Political Equality League, dedicated to building suffrage support across New York State and eventually nationally. The organization, funded primarily by her own fortune supplemented by donations she solicits from wealthy contacts, establishes a network of what contemporary sources call suffrage settlements, houses and lunchrooms where working women can eat cheaply, hear lectures about political rights and labor organizing, and discuss politics without fear of employer retaliation. The model combines social welfare with political education. A woman arriving for an affordable lunch might stay for a lecture on how women's votes could improve factory safety laws or housing conditions. The spaces are simple rather than luxurious. Wooden chairs, plain tables, simple stoves for cooking, but they represent Alva's growing understanding that political organizing requires infrastructure, places where women can gather without depending on churches or settlement houses controlled by men who might not support suffrage. In Harlem, in meetings documented by both contemporary Black newspapers and later scholarship, Alva works with Black club women to form a colored branch of her organization. The women she collaborates with, Sarah J.S. Garnett, the first black woman principal in New York City public schools, Frances Reynolds Kaiser, Marie C. Lawton, Irene Mormon, bring decades of organizing experience and a clear-eyed understanding of how race intersects with gender in determining political power. Articles like Suffrage for Negresses in the New York Times from September 1911 record these meetings, though the language is patronizing and the coverage incomplete. The relationship is complex and fraught. Alva provides funding and social legitimacy that help the branch gain recognition, but she cannot erase the racial hierarchies that structure even progressive movements. Some sources suggest genuine collaboration and mutual respect. Others hint at tensions over autonomy and strategy. What is clear from archival records is that black women understood suffrage as part of a larger struggle for civil rights and economic justice, while white suffragists often saw it as a standalone goal that could be achieved without addressing racial inequality. Inside a cramped meeting room in Harlem, on a winter evening in 1911, kerosene lamps cast yellow light on faces of seamstresses, teachers, domestic workers, laundresses, women who work long hours for small wages and return home to second shifts of cooking, cleaning, childcare. The room smells of lamp oil and winter coats drying, of coffee brewing on a small stove. On the table, beside pamphlets explaining New York's complex voting laws, sits a stack of lined paper and envelopes. After the talk, women stay behind to practice writing letters to legislators, coached in salutation, argument, and signature by a woman whose own pen once addressed duchesses and senators with equal facility. The etiquette of correspondence, the careful attention to proper forms of address and conventions of business letters, once tools for securing social invitations and advancing family interests, has become a means for demanding laws. Dear Assemblyman, begins one letter drafted that evening, preserved in suffrage archives. I write to urge your support for women's suffrage in New York State. As a working woman and taxpayer, I have a vital interest in the laws that govern my labor and my life. The phrasing is formal, the handwriting careful, the argument combining personal experience with civic principle. But the same movement that seeks universal rights still struggles to include all women equally. White suffragists often deploy racist arguments, suggesting that educated white women deserve votes to counter the influence of black and immigrant men. Black suffragists counter that all women deserve votes as a matter of human rights, not as a tool for maintaining white supremacy. The tension remains unresolved, visible in archives, but often absent from celebratory histories. When the movement steps out from cramped rooms into the streets of New York in 1912, staging massive public parades that transform political organizing into spectacle, Alva will discover what it means to put her own body and reputation on public display in ways that go far beyond the controlled performances of Gilded Age ballrooms. On 4 May 1912, New York hosted one of its largest suffrage parades, a carefully choreographed spectacle designed to demonstrate that the movement includes women of all classes and that respectable women support the vote. Contemporary accounts estimate crowds of up to 10,000 participants marching up Fifth Avenue from Washington Square to Carnegie Hall, with many thousands more watching from sidewalks and windows. The day is bright and mild. Spring flowers bloom in window boxes and parks. The city feels alive with possibility. As president of the Political Equality Association, Alva leads one division of marchers over a 50-block route that tests endurance in ways her Newport Gardens never did. Later, in an interview published in a suffrage newspaper, she will describe the physical experience. Hours of walking in tight corsetry designed for standing or sitting, but never sustained exertion. Under heavy hats pinned securely to elaborately dressed hair. In shoes made for salons and drawing rooms, not for pavements that jar every step, as a terrible ordeal. The sound of drums, the beat of thousands of marching feet creating a rhythm that can be felt as vibration in the chest, the rattle of carriage wheels on cobblestones as vehicles navigate around the parade route merge into a single urban symphony both exhilarating and exhausting. Press photographs, now preserved in collections at the New York Public Library and the Library of Congress, show lines of women in white dresses carrying banners, some emblazoned with "Votes for Women" in bold letters visible from blocks away, others showing state suffrage maps or portraits of pioneer suffragists. The white dresses are strategic. They signal purity, unity, and visibility in crowd scenes. Somewhere in the crowd, near Alva's contingent of society women and settlement house workers marching together, a young Chinese student named Mabel Pinghua Li, just 16 years old, rides on horseback at the head of another group, an image of changing America that the mainstream press barely notes, but that Chinese-language newspapers celebrate as historic. The parade includes divisions organized by profession: teachers, nurses, factory workers, artists, writers, each group demonstrating that women across all occupations support suffrage. There are musicians playing patriotic songs, speakers on decorated floats delivering speeches about democracy and justice, children dressed in white carrying small banners. The spectacle is designed to counter claims that the only mannish women or social deviants want the vote, to show that respectable mothers and wives and daughters seek political power. But the ordeal is real. Corsets designed to create fashionable silhouettes restrict breathing and movement. The heavy hats and elaborate hairstyles create headaches that throb with each step. The spring sunshine that seems pleasant at first becomes oppressive as hours pass. Women who are accustomed to riding in carriages or having servants attend to every need discover what it means to walk for miles, to stand when feet ache, to keep marching when exhaustion threatens to break formation. Some collapse and are assisted to the sidelines. Most continue, understanding that the visibility of their suffering serves political purpose. That evening, with knees aching and feet blistered, Alva sits once more at her desk to sign thank you notes to marchers and donors whose contributions paid for banners and advertisements and permits. The ritual is the same: pen moving across monogram stationery, stack of envelopes growing, seal pressed into wax. But the exhaustion is new, a physical reminder that political work costs something beyond money and social capital. What finishing schools once taught as carriage, the ability to hold oneself upright under scrutiny, to present composed elegance regardless of discomfort, has become literally tested in miles walked for a single, simple demand: the right to vote. In 1913, a visit to militant suffragettes in London will shift her understanding from parades and petitions toward more confrontational politics, from spectacle designed to win approval toward tactics designed to force change even when approval is impossible. In 1913, during travels in Britain that ostensibly concern personal affairs, but increasingly focus on political education, and on her return to New York with new conviction about tactics and strategy, Alva attends rallies and lectures by the Women's Social and Political Union, led by Emmeline Pankhurst and her daughter Christabel. Contemporary newspaper reports note her presence at events, her praise for what the British press calls militant methods, and her public defense of women imprisoned and force-fed for acts of property destruction and civil disobedience. She hears firsthand accounts of women starving themselves in Holloway Prison and being brutally force-fed through tubes inserted in nose or mouth, of arrests for breaking windows or setting fire to empty buildings, of tactics that shock respectable opinion but generate publicity impossible to achieve through polite petitions. That summer, in an action documented in multiple biographical sources and contemporary news accounts, she hosts Christabel Pankhurst at one of her American houses after the British leader flees England to escape arrest on charges of conspiracy to commit property damage. Later, when Emmeline Pankhurst is detained at Ellis Island en route to a U.S. fundraising tour, immigration officials citing her criminal record from suffrage activities, Alva intervenes, using her social connections and political influence to secure Emmeline's release and to host her during American appearances. The assistance is both practical and symbolic: wealthy American widow lending legitimacy and protection to militant British organizers who might otherwise be dismissed as dangerous radicals. In correspondence and interviews preserved in suffrage archives, Alva links property destruction in Britain to the long history of men using force to secure political change. The American Revolution began with destruction of tea in Boston Harbor. Labor movements won rights through strikes and sometimes violence. Civil wars and revolutions have always involved property damage. Why? She asks in a letter to a newspaper editor. Should women be held to a higher standard of nonviolence than men have ever maintained? The argument is strategic rather than personally militant. She herself never breaks windows or sets fires, but it provides intellectual justification for tactics more confrontational than the respectable parades and petitions favored by older suffrage organizations. In a New York sitting room in her townhouse, afternoon light falling on Chinese porcelain collected during travels and French chairs purchased in Paris, winter cold kept at bay by modern steam heating, she drafts statements to newspapers, her pen scratching more angrily now across paper that grows thick with crossed-out phrases and revised arguments. Pray to God, she reportedly tells one younger activist in a conversation recorded in that woman's diary. She will help you, a sentence that inverts the pious resignation once expected of society women into a kind of rallying cry, suggesting both divine sanction for women's demands and a feminist theology that reimagines deity as female. The theology is not worked out in systematic detail. Alva is an organizer rather than a theorist, but the statement reveals shifting consciousness. The woman who once attended Episcopal services to be seen by the right people, who donated to churches as part of social strategy, now invokes religion as support for political radicalism. The gloved hands that once held prayer books in fashionable churches now hold pamphlets calling for civil disobedience. The woman who once weaponized social ritual with precision, understanding exactly how an invitation or a seating arrangement could communicate power, is now learning to justify civil disobedience, to defend tactics that respectable society condemns, to align herself with women willing to go to prison for political beliefs. Yet she still moves within gilded rooms, still writes on monogram stationery, still commands resources beyond the reach of working women she claims as allies. Her pen remains as sharp as any stone thrown at a window, but it is still a pen, not a stone, wielded from comfort, not desperation. Within a year, the alliances she forges will shift from drawing rooms to a new kind of marriage, a political union with Alice Paul and the Congressional Union for Woman Suffrage that will define the final push for a federal amendment. In the summer of 1914, Marble House again filled with guests arriving by carriage and automobile down Bellevue Avenue, but the invitations now read not ball or reception, but Conference of Great Women. According to later National Woman's Party histories and contemporary newspaper accounts in the Newport Mercury, this Newport gathering, convened by Alva with characteristic attention to detail and public relations, brings together leading suffragists from across the nation to discuss strategy for a federal amendment guaranteeing women's voting rights rather than continuing the slower state-by-state approach favored by older organizations. On the terrace overlooking the Atlantic, where Alva once hosted lawn parties for European nobility and New York society, the sound of waves breaking against rocks below mixes with the murmur of political discussion. Women in summer whites and practical shirtwaists lean forward in their chairs, notebooks in hand, debating constitutional strategy and congressional tactics. The ocean breeze carries salt air and the scent of roses from the gardens, creating an atmosphere both beautiful and serious, combining Newport's legendary landscape with the urgency of political work that cannot wait for perfect weather or perfect circumstances. Among the speakers is Consuelo, now the separated Duchess of Marlborough, living primarily in London, who has become an advocate for prison reform and women's rights in Britain, working on campaigns to improve conditions for women prisoners and to reform laws governing married women's property. Contemporary photographs show mother and daughter appearing side by side, both dressed elegantly but without the elaborate costumes of their Gilded Age prime. The caption notes titles and causes, suffrage work and reform advocacy, but nothing about the coercive marriage that once bound them, or the years of estrangement that followed. Some biographies suggest a rapprochement born of shared political work. Others note continuing distance despite public collaboration. What is certain from preserved correspondence is that both women now channel their energy toward changing systems that constrain all women, not just toward securing their own positions within those systems. Inside Marble House, in a small study off the Gothic room, where carved walnut panels line the walls and stained glass windows filter afternoon light into jewel tones, Alva reviews notes for resolutions to be sent to legislators, draft language for proposed constitutional amendments, letters to congressional leaders whose support will be essential. The marriage settlement she negotiates now is between her Political Equality Association and Alice Paul's Congressional Union for Woman Suffrage, which she will soon fund with thousands of dollars and join as a prominent member, bringing social legitimacy and financial resources to an organization committed to militant tactics and federal strategy. The negotiation reveals familiar patterns. Alva providing money and social connections in exchange for leadership position and influence over strategy, younger activists needing resources but wary of control by wealthy women who might not share their radical vision. Compromises hammered out in private meetings before public announcements. The archives of the National Woman's Party preserve correspondence showing these tensions and their resolution, demonstrating that even movements for equality must navigate hierarchies of wealth and power. The social strategist who once bartered a daughter for a dukedom, who understood marriage as a transaction in which women were currency exchanged between families to secure alliances and maintain fortunes, is now bargaining for alliances among women determined to change the Constitution so that all women will have political standing, independent of fathers and husbands. The architecture of power has shifted from chateaux and palaces built with railroad fortunes to committees and caucuses built with donated time and money, from drawing room negotiations about dowries to committee room debates about amendment language. But the fundamental skill remains: understanding power and how to leverage it. As evening falls and guests depart, some staying at nearby Newport cottages and others returning to hotels in town, Alva remains at her desk writing letters to congressional allies and planning next steps. The next stage of this union will take her far from Newport's lawns to San Francisco's exposition halls where Western suffrage victories will be celebrated, and eventually to the gates of the White House where women will stand in silent protest demanding action from a president who speaks eloquently about democracy abroad while denying it to half of America's citizens. By 1915, as the Panama Pacific International Exposition opened in San Francisco to celebrate the completion of the Panama Canal and showcase American progress to the world, Alva chaired the Women Voters Convention associated with the fair. Encyclopedic entries and contemporary newspaper accounts note her formal role at the event, placing her name alongside Western suffrage leaders in the program and describing her speeches to assembled delegates from states where women already vote alongside representatives from states still fighting for suffrage. The Western states, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Idaho, Washington, California, Oregon, Kansas, Arizona, Nevada, where women have secured voting rights through state constitutional amendments, provide both inspiration and strategic advantage. They demonstrate that women's suffrage is practical, not theoretical, that democracy does not collapse when women vote. In an exposition hall decorated with state flags and strings of electric lights that showcase the technological progress that defines American modernity, the air heavy with the smell of sawdust and fresh paint from construction still underway, warm San Francisco sunshine filtered through tall windows, she presides over sessions that blend pageantry with policy. Newspapers describe exhibits celebrating states where women already vote, featuring photographs of women at polling places and statistics on laws passed since women gained suffrage. Debates over whether a federal amendment should supersede the state-by-state strategy favored by the National American Woman Suffrage Association, led by Carrie Chapman Catt, and tensions between organizations that reflect both strategic differences and personal rivalries accumulated over decades of movement work. The convention includes performances, speeches, awards, ceremonies recognizing pioneer suffragists, now elderly or deceased, and presentations about international suffrage movements in countries from New Zealand to Norway. The atmosphere combines celebration with urgent awareness that despite Western Victories: most American women remain without votes, that the progress that seems inevitable in California still faces fierce resistance in eastern and southern states. Between sessions, at a writing table in a temporary office set up in a side room with a view of the exposition grounds where crowds mill among pavilions showcasing everything from agriculture to fine arts, Alva signs resolutions and telegrams to Eastern legislators, her handwriting as controlled as ever despite the chaos and excitement surrounding her. The stack of correspondence grows: letters to congressional leaders, telegrams to state suffrage organizations, notes to reporters covering the convention. The difference lies in the addressees, no longer ball guests or bishops requesting donations, but senators and party leaders whose votes will determine whether a federal amendment can pass Congress and be sent to states for ratification. The rituals of convention life: calls to order delivered with gavels that echo through halls, minutes read aloud and approved by voice votes, resolutions debated and amended and passed, echo the order of a formal dinner where each course arrives in proper sequence and each guest knows their role. But here, rank is measured not in titles or inherited wealth, but in votes counted and districts won, in years of organizing and campaigns led. Alva's prominence comes from money donated and networks leveraged, but also from willingness to appear publicly at events, to lend her name to causes that respectable women might avoid, to risk reputation she spent decades building. As the convention closes and delegates depart for their home states, carrying resolutions and renewed determination, Alva returns to New York with conviction that federal strategy is correct, that state-by-state campaigns will take generations while a constitutional amendment could secure universal women's suffrage within years. She commits her financial support to Alice Paul's Congressional Union, which will transform into the National Woman's Party in 1916, dedicated exclusively to federal amendment work and willing to use confrontational tactics when polite lobbying fails. Within 2 years, the fight will move from convention halls to the White House fence, where women will stand in silent protest through all weather and all seasons, and Alva's money and name will stand behind women prepared to be arrested, imprisoned, and force-fed for demanding the same political rights men take for granted. On 10 January 1917, a dozen members of the National Woman's Party begin silent picketing outside the White House, holding banners that quote President Woodrow Wilson's own words on democracy: "We shall fight for the things which we have always held nearest our hearts, for democracy, for the right of those who submit to authority to have a voice in their own government, back at an administration that supports democracy for Europe while opposing it for American women." The Silent Sentinels, as they come to be called, will maintain their vigil for more than 2 years through winter cold and summer heat, through public mockery and violent attacks, through hundreds of arrests. Alva, who helped Alice Paul transform the Congressional Union into the National Woman's Party in 1916 during meetings in Washington where strategy was debated and organizational structures established, funds much of this campaign: office rent for National Woman's Party headquarters on Lafayette Square near the White House, printing costs for banners and pamphlets, travel expenses for organizers coming to Washington from across the country, and, when arrests begin in June 1917, bail for imprisoned women and lawyers to defend them in court. Press accounts record her as the party's principal benefactor, Mrs. O.H.P. Belmont, in the formal style newspapers use for widows of prominent men, whose Newport and New York fortunes now underwrite federal confrontation rather than social triumph. Photographs preserved in Library of Congress archives show the Sentinels in long coats and hats standing on Pennsylvania Avenue sidewalk in all weather, banners snapping in winter wind or drooping in summer humidity. Though Alva is not among those arrested in Washington at 73 years old in 1917, she supports the campaign financially and publicly, but does not stand on picket lines through seasons of protest. She corresponds with prisoners, sends food parcels to those in Occoquan Workhouse and District Jail who report terrible conditions and brutal treatment, and issues statements defending them against charges of being unpatriotic during wartime. The arrests begin in June 1917, shortly after America enters World War I, when administration patience with protesters outside the White House evaporates. Women are charged with obstructing traffic on sidewalks they have occupied peacefully for months. Sentences escalate from days to weeks to months. Conditions in Occoquan Workhouse are deliberately harsh, designed to break spirits and end protests. Women report sleeping on filthy straw mattresses, eating rotten food, enduring solitary confinement in cells without light or ventilation. When they demand recognition as political prisoners rather than common criminals and begin hunger strikes to protest conditions, they are force-fed through tubes inserted roughly into their nose or throat, experiencing the same brutal treatment Alva heard about from British suffragettes in 1913. Somewhere in a file drawer at National Woman's Party headquarters, letters from prisoners and Alva's replies sit side by side. "Hold fast. I am with you. Your courage inspires us all." Written on her monogram stationery that now serves political solidarity rather than social niceties. The contrast between her comfortable surroundings and their prison cells is stark. She writes from heated rooms with servants attending every need while they shiver in unheated cells and fight with rats for food, but her money pays for their legal defense, for newspaper advertisements publicizing their treatment, for campaigns that eventually force Wilson administration to reconsider opposition to federal amendment. The woman who once used her power to coerce a young bride into a marriage-serving family ambition now uses it to sustain women who refuse to yield to any authority that denies them rights, who choose prison rather than abandoning principles. Yet the structure is fundamentally the same: influence expressed through money, social standing, and the unblinking confidence to confront a president. When the 19th Amendment is finally ratified on 26 August 1920, after years of congressional debate and state ratification campaigns, Alva's struggle will not end. She will turn her organizing toward what women can do with the vote and toward reckoning with her own past. On 26 August 1920, the 19th Amendment was certified by Secretary of State Bainbridge Colby, and American women gained the right to vote nationwide after 72 years of organized suffrage campaigns. In the following year, at a National Woman's Party convention in Washington, attended by hundreds of women who worked for this victory, Alva is elected president of the organization, a post she will hold until her death in 1933. At 75 years old, she is not retiring from public life, but doubling down on political work, shifting focus from winning the vote to ensuring women use it effectively and to pursuing additional legal reforms through an Equal Rights Amendment. Yet it is another legal proceeding in 1926 that exposes the deepest fault line in her life and calls into question the moral authority she claims as feminist leader, as the Vatican considers annulling Consuelo's first marriage to allow her to remarry in the Catholic Church. She wishes to marry French aviator Jacques Balsan, a union that requires Catholic recognition despite her earlier divorce. Alva gives testimony acknowledging that she used coercion, including feigned illness and threats, to force her daughter to marry the Duke of Marlborough in 1895. Catholic and secular papers alike quote her stark admission, preserved in Vatican archives and later published in multiple sources. "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke. I have always had absolute power over my daughter." The statement, given under oath in proceedings designed to determine whether Consuelo's consent to the 1895 marriage was genuine, is required for annulment but also serves as confession that what she presented as a love match was actually coercion, that the elaborate wedding at St. Thomas Church was ceremony without consent. In a quiet New York office in her townhouse where afternoon light falls across Persian rugs and French furniture, she reviews the typed transcript of her statement, glove finger, tracing the lines of testimony that will be sent to Rome for consideration by Catholic authorities. It is, in a sense, another document of women's rights, a record of how a mother's unchecked authority, accepted and even celebrated by Gilded Age society, could negate a daughter's consent as completely as any law denying women legal personhood. The irony is sharp. The suffrage president, whose signatures carried weight in Washington and whose speeches called for women's autonomy, now signs her name to a confession that undercuts the very right most central to her cause, the right to choose. The testimony becomes public, reported in newspapers that cover the annulment with a mixture of interest and scandal. Some suffrage allies defend her, arguing that she has evolved beyond the values of her Gilded Age prime, that her political work represents repudiation of the woman who forced her daughter into marriage. Others note the hypocrisy. How can a woman who denied her own daughter's autonomy claim to champion women's rights? The contradiction remains unresolved in historical accounts, with biographers debating whether her suffrage work represents genuine conversion or strategic repositioning. What is documented in archives is that Consuelo's annulment is granted, that she marries Jacques Balsan in 1921, and that mother and daughter maintain relationship despite the past, corresponding regularly and occasionally appearing together at events. Some letters suggest genuine affection beneath formality. Others hint at wounds that never fully heal. In photographs from the 1920s, they appear together but not touching, dressed elegantly but maintaining distance, smiling for cameras, but with expressions that suggest complexity beneath the surfaces. As Alva turned increasingly to philanthropy and architecture in the late 1920s, purchasing the National Woman's Party headquarters building in Washington and supporting equal rights amendment campaigns, the question lingers. What does it mean when a woman who fought for every woman's vote admits she once erased her own child's voice? The answer, if there is one, lies not in Alva's public statements, but in the private spaces between letters, in the silences that correspondence cannot capture, in the paradox of a woman who used power to liberate women collectively while wielding it oppressively in her most intimate relationship. On 21 May 1929, the National Woman's Party completed the purchase of an 1,800 brick house at a 144 Constitution Avenue in Washington, D.C., directly opposite the Capitol, where Congress had debated equal rights amendment proposals for decades. Contemporary reports in newspapers like the Washington Post note that the property, soon dubbed the Alva Belmont House, in recognition of the primary donor, is bought with funds she provides specifically for establishing permanent headquarters for the organization she has supported since its founding. The building will serve as both offices for ongoing political work and a museum for preserving suffrage movement history that participants fear might otherwise be lost. Within its rooms, banners from the White House pickets are carefully stored in acid-free boxes, their fabric still bearing stains from weather and rough handling during arrests. Minutes of strategy meetings are filed in organized archives that document years of organizing, and Alva's correspondence is stacked in labeled boxes, each letter cataloged by date and recipient. Her letters, once invitations to balls and menus for elaborate dinners, then notes coordinating suffrage campaigns and supporting imprisoned picketers, now discuss equal rights amendment language with lawyers who draft constitutional text, international women's councils where American delegates can learn from global movements, and the urgent need to preserve women's political history before aging activists die and their papers are scattered or destroyed. The building becomes both a practical workspace and a symbolic monument. Offices where current campaigns are organized sit alongside rooms displaying photographs of marches and rallies, glass cases holding Votes for Women China, and sashes worn in parades, walls covered with banners that once flew outside the White House. Visitors can see the artifacts of struggle, simple objects made sacred by context, porcelain and fabric transformed into historical evidence. On 26 January 1933, in Paris, where she had been living for several months, Alva Belmont died after a stroke at the age of 80. Her funeral at St. Thomas Church in New York, the same church where she forced Consuelo to marry the Duke of Marlborough 38 years earlier, features all-female pallbearers in a deliberate challenge to custom that reserves that honor for men, and a large contingent of suffragists bearing banners before she is interred beside Oliver Belmont in the mausoleum at Woodlawn Cemetery. Contemporary newspaper coverage describes the service as a political statement as much as a memorial, noting speeches that celebrate her suffrage work while remaining largely silent about her Gilded Age social triumphs. Today, the former Sewall Belmont House, as it was later renamed to honor both Alva Belmont and suffragist Alice Paul's associate and party treasurer, Belva Lockwood Sewall, is the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument, administered by the National Park Service. Its exhibits display the Votes for Women China Alva, commissioned for Marble House conferences, banners carried in parades she funded, photographs of marches she organized, all carefully preserved in climate-controlled cases with explanatory labels that contextualize objects within broader movement history. In the quiet of one upstairs room, a visitor can stand before a glass case and look at a single sheet of monogrammed stationery. The ink faded to brown, but still legible, carefully preserved between sheets of archival tissue. It is addressed not to a duke or a dowager, not to a society matron or a bishop, but to Dear Madam Senator, a form of address that would have been impossible when Alva began her life, evidence of changes her work helped achieve. The gloved hand that once signed away a daughter's freedom, that wrote invitations to balls where hierarchy was reinforced and wealth displayed, that composed thank you notes maintaining social networks that excluded as much as they included, has left, in that looping signature, a different kind of legacy. The story begins in a ballroom where a mother arranged a marriage like a treaty, using all the skills of her class to coerce compliance, believing that power rightfully belonged to those who could seize and hold it. It ends in a small sunlit room across from the Capitol, where her handwriting sits behind glass, an artifact of how grace, once used to enforce obedience and maintain hierarchies, was slowly, imperfectly, and never completely turned into a weapon for change.